Throughout history, melanin-rich African people have faced systemic discrimination in various forms, including slavery, colonization, segregation, apartheid, police brutality, economic exploitation, educational inequalities, healthcare disparities, and cultural appropriation. These injustices have deprived them of basic human rights, opportunities, and dignity, perpetuating intergenerational trauma and inequality. Here are some specific examples of discrimination faced by melanin-rich African people in historical contexts. 1. Slavery in the United States. African people were forcibly brought to the United States as slaves, enduring brutal conditions, family separations, and dehumanization, resulting in centuries of generational trauma and systemic racism. 2. Colonialism in Africa. European powers colonized Africa, exploiting its resources, imposing discriminatory laws, and perpetuating racial hierarchies that marginalized indigenous African populations and led to cultural erasure and economic exploitation. 3. Apartheid in South Africa. The apartheid system in South Africa enforced racial segregation, denied basic rights to black South Africans, restricted their movement, and perpetuated economic disparities based on race, leading to widespread oppression and resistance movements. 4. Jim Crow era in the United States. The Jim Crow laws in the southern United States enforced racial segregation, restricted voting rights, and perpetuated systemic discrimination against African Americans, leading to separate and unequal treatment in all aspects of life. 5. Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 resulted in the targeted mass killing of Tutsi people by Hutu extremists, fueled by ethnic tensions and colonial legacies, leading to widespread violence, displacement, and trauma among the affected populations. 6. European imperialism in the Congo. Belgian colonization of the Congo in the late 19th and early 20th centuries led to widespread exploitation of resources, forced labor, and violent repression of indigenous populations, causing immense suffering and loss of life. 7. Segregation in the Caribbean. In countries like Jamaica and Barbados, historical segregation policies based on race marginalized Afro-Caribbean populations, limiting their access to education, employment opportunities, and political representation. 8. Forced labor in Mauritius. The use of indentured laborers, including African and Indian populations, in colonial Mauritius subjected them to harsh working conditions, limited freedoms, and economic exploitation, contributing to social inequality and discrimination. 9. Transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly transported millions of African people to the Americas, Europe, and the Caribbean as slaves, leading to the dehumanization, exploitation, and intergenerational trauma of enslaved individuals and their descendants. 10. Black codes in the Reconstruction era. After the Civil War in the United States, black codes were laws enacted in southern states to restrict the rights and freedoms of newly emancipated African Americans, perpetuating a system of racial inequality and disenfranchisement. 11. Tuskegee syphilis study. The Tuskegee syphilis study conducted in the United States from 1932 to 1972 involved withholding treatment for syphilis from African American men without their consent, leading to unethical medical practices and long-term harm to the participants. 12. Forced sterilization programs. In countries like South Africa and the United States, forced sterilization programs targeted African and indigenous populations, particularly women, as a form of population control and eugenics, violating their reproductive rights and autonomy. 13. Mass incarceration in the United States. The disproportionate incarceration of African Americans in the United States, stemming from policies like the war on drugs and mandatory minimum sentencing, has led to systemic discrimination, economic disenfranchisement, and social marginalization within communities of color. 14. Cultural appropriation. The appropriation of African cultural practices, artifacts, and traditions by colonial powers and dominant cultures has perpetuated stereotypes, commodified cultural heritage, and marginalized African voices, contributing to the erasure of diverse narratives and identities. 15. Education disparities. Historically, African communities have faced unequal access to quality education, limited resources, and discriminatory practices in schools, leading to academic achievement gaps, lower graduation rates, and limited opportunities for socio-economic advancement. 16. Environmental racism. Communities of color, including melanin-rich African populations, have been disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards, pollution, and toxic waste due to discriminatory zoning policies, industrial practices, and lack of environmental justice, resulting in adverse health outcomes and environmental degradation. 17. Land dispossession. Land dispossession and forced displacement of African communities, particularly in regions with valuable natural resources, have resulted in loss of livelihoods, cultural heritage, and ancestral connections to the land, perpetuating cycles of poverty, inequality, and social marginalization. 18. Colorism within communities. Colorism, a form of discrimination based on skin tone within racial or ethnic groups, has perpetuated stereotypes, beauty standards, and social hierarchies that privilege lighter-skinned individuals over those with darker skin, resulting in internalized stigma and division within communities. 19. Medical experimentation. Historically, African populations have been subjects of unethical medical experimentation and testing without informed consent, such as the use of experimental drugs, surgical procedures, or reproductive interventions that have led to harm, exploitation, and distrust of medical institutions. 20. Exploitation in the entertainment industry. African artists, performers, and cultural producers have faced exploitation, misrepresentation, and limited opportunities for recognition and compensation in the global entertainment industry, often being relegated to stereotypical roles or denied creative agency. 21. Forced assimilation policies. Colonial powers imposed forced assimilation policies on African populations, including the suppression of indigenous languages, cultural practices, and traditions, aiming to erase ethnic identities and impose Eurocentric values and norms, resulting in cultural loss and identity struggles. 22. Internment camps and refugee crises. During times of conflict and displacement, African populations have been subjected to internment camps, refugee crises, and detention centers where they face overcrowding, inadequate living conditions, and lack of access to basic necessities, exacerbating their vulnerability and trauma. 23. Systemic inequalities in healthcare. Melanin-rich African communities face systemic inequalities in access to healthcare, quality medical services, and health outcomes due to factors such as racial bias, economic disparities, and limited representation in healthcare leadership, leading to disparities in disease prevention, treatment, and healthcare delivery. 24. Surveillance and policing of Black communities. African communities have been subjected to widespread surveillance, racial profiling, and discriminatory policing practices that target individuals based on their race, leading to increased rates of harassment, violence, and incarceration within Black communities, perpetuating cycles of distrust and fear. 25. Discrimination in housing and urban planning. African communities have experienced discrimination in housing policies, urban planning, and development projects that result in substandard housing, gentrification, displacement, and segregation based on race, contributing to spatial inequalities and social divisions within cities and neighborhoods. 26. Environmental racism. Melanin-rich African communities are disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards, pollution, and toxic waste sites, leading to adverse health effects, higher rates of environmental-related illnesses, and limited access to clean air, water, and safe living environments. 27. Educational disparities. Melanin-rich African students experience educational disparities, including unequal access to quality schools, resources, and opportunities for academic advancement, resulting in lower graduation rates, limited educational attainment, and perpetuation of intergenerational poverty and inequality. 28. Cultural appropriation. African cultural expressions, traditions, and artifacts are often appropriated, commodified, and misrepresented by non-African individuals and industries for profit, disregarding the cultural significance, ownership, and integrity of these practices and perpetuating harmful stereotypes and erasure of African identities. 29. Digital divide and technological inequities. Melanin-rich African communities face digital disparities and technological inequities, including limited access to internet connectivity, devices, digital literacy skills, and online platforms, exacerbating social exclusion, economic marginalization, and barriers to participation in the digital economy. 30. Disenfranchisement and voter suppression. African populations encounter disenfranchisement and voter suppression tactics that restrict their political participation, such as voter ID laws, gerrymandering, polling place closures, and intimidation tactics, undermining their rights to vote, representation, and political influence. 31. Discrimination in sports and athletics. African athletes and sports professionals encounter discrimination, racial bias, and unequal treatment in sports institutions, competitions, and media coverage, facing challenges in recruitment, sponsorship, endorsement opportunities, and fair representation in the sports industry. 32. Gender-based violence and discrimination. Melanin-rich African women and gender-diverse individuals experience intersecting forms of discrimination, gender-based violence, and marginalization due to factors such as patriarchy, colonial legacies, cultural norms, and lack of access to resources, support, and rights. 33. Identity erasure and misrepresentation. African identities, histories, and narratives are often erased, distorted, and misrepresented in mainstream media, education curricula, and cultural representations, perpetuating stereotypes, marginalization, and erasure of diverse African voices and experiences. 34. Labor exploitation and precarious work. African laborers face exploitation, precarious work conditions, and lack of labor rights protections in industries such as agriculture, domestic work, manufacturing, and informal sectors, leading to low wages, unsafe working conditions, and vulnerability to labor abuses and exploitation. 35. Climate change vulnerability. Melanin-rich African communities are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, including extreme weather events, desertification, sea level rise, and agricultural disruptions, exacerbating food insecurity, displacement, and environmental challenges that threaten livelihoods and well-being. 36. Criminal justice system injustices. Melanin-rich African individuals are disproportionately targeted, arrested, convicted, and incarcerated in the criminal justice system, facing racial profiling, harsh sentencing, mass incarceration, and unequal treatment in law enforcement practices, court proceedings, and correctional facilities. 37. Language and cultural heritage preservation. African languages, cultural heritage, and traditional knowledge are endangered by colonization, globalization, and cultural assimilation, leading to language loss, cultural erosion, and marginalization of indigenous African languages and practices in education, media, and public discourse. 38. Mental health stigma and access barriers. Melanin-rich African communities encounter stigma, discrimination, and limited access to mental health services and resources, leading to disparities in mental health outcomes, underdiagnosis, and inadequate support for mental health challenges and wellness needs. 39. Financial discrimination and economic inequality. African populations face financial discrimination, economic exclusion, and wealth disparities, including limited access to banking services, credit, business opportunities, investment capital, and employment opportunities, perpetuating cycles of poverty and economic marginalization. 40. Forced displacement and refugee crises. African populations are affected by forced displacement, conflicts, violence, and refugee crises, leading to displacement, refugee camps, migration challenges, and lack of durable solutions, exacerbating humanitarian needs, protection concerns, and displacement crises in Africa and globally. 41. Media representation and stereotyping. Melanin-rich African communities are often stereotyped, misrepresented, and caricatured in media representations, entertainment industry, advertising, and popular culture, perpetuating harmful stereotypes, biases, and limited portrayal of diverse African experiences and realities. 42. LGBTQ+ discrimination and exclusion. African LGBTQ+ individuals face discrimination, violence, and legal persecution based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and diversity, encountering stigma, exclusion, and human rights violations in societal structures, legal frameworks, and cultural attitudes towards LGBTQ+ rights and equality. 43. Access to quality healthcare. Melanin-rich African populations experience barriers to quality healthcare services, including limited access to medical facilities, healthcare professionals, medications, preventive care, and health information, leading to health disparities, unmet healthcare needs, and challenges in addressing health inequities. 44. Historical trauma and intergenerational effects. African communities carry the legacies of historical trauma, colonization, slavery, and systemic injustices, leading to intergenerational effects, collective trauma, and inherited trauma responses that impact mental health, social cohesion, and community resilience over generations. 45. Cultural recognition and intellectual property rights. African cultures, artistic expressions, and intellectual property rights are often exploited, appropriated, and undervalued by global industries, leading to cultural misappropriation, lack of recognition, and economic disparities in the creative and cultural sectors. 46. Environmental racism and ecological injustices. African communities bear the brunt of environmental racism, toxic pollution, land dispossession, and climate change impacts, facing environmental hazards, ecological degradation, and disproportionate exposure to environmental risks and disasters. 47. Educational disparities and school segregation. Melanin-rich African students encounter educational disparities, school segregation, underfunded schools, biased curricula, and disciplinary inequalities, leading to academic underachievement, school-to-prison pipeline, and limited access to quality education and opportunities. 48. Digital divide and technological inequality. African populations experience digital disparities, lack of access to technology, internet connectivity, digital skills, and digital infrastructure, widening the digital divide and limiting opportunities for digital participation, innovation, and economic development. 49. Language discrimination and linguistic diversity. African languages face discrimination, marginalization, and endangerment in education, media, governance, and public discourse, leading to language loss, limited linguistic diversity, and unequal recognition of African language rights and heritage. 50. Political exclusion and voting rights suppression. Melanin-rich African communities encounter political exclusion, voter suppression, gerrymandering, and obstacles to political participation, facing barriers to exercise their voting rights, representation, and civic engagement in democratic processes and governance. 51. Gender inequality and women's rights violations. African women and girls experience gender-based discrimination, violence, economic disparities, and violations of women's rights, facing gender inequality, patriarchy, harmful traditional practices, and barriers to gender equality and empowerment. 52. Access to clean water and sanitation. African populations lack access to clean water, sanitation facilities, hygiene resources, and water infrastructure, leading to water scarcity, waterborne diseases, health disparities, and challenges in ensuring water security and hygiene practices. 53. Disability discrimination and accessible services. Melanin-rich African individuals with disabilities face discrimination, barriers to accessibility, limited resources, and exclusion from services, infrastructure, and opportunities, impacting their rights, inclusion, and participation in society. 54. Cultural heritage preservation and restitution. African cultural heritage sites, artifacts, and sacred objects are subject to looting, illegal trafficking, and cultural appropriation, highlighting the need for cultural heritage preservation, restitution efforts, and respect for African heritage rights and stewardship. 55. Identity intersectionality and multiple marginalizations. African individuals navigate intersecting identities, multiple marginalizations, and complex experiences of discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, disability, and social status, requiring holistic approaches to address intersecting forms of oppression and vulnerability. 56. Commercial exploitation and labor injustices. African laborers experience exploitation, low wages, unsafe working conditions, and labor rights violations in industries such as agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, perpetuating economic inequalities, forced labor, and modern-day slavery practices. 57. Land dispossession and forced evictions. African communities confront land dispossession, forced evictions, land grabbing, and displacement due to infrastructure projects, urban development, extractive industries, and land conflicts, leading to loss of livelihoods, cultural displacement, and violation of land rights. 58. Health inequities and medical racism. Melanin-rich African populations encounter health inequities, medical racism, unequal access to health care, bias in medical treatment, and disparities in health outcomes, contributing to higher rates of disease burden, mortality, and healthcare mistrust. 59. Media misrepresentation and stereotyping. African communities are often misrepresented, stereotyped, and marginalized in media portrayals, entertainment industry, news coverage, and popular culture, perpetuating negative stereotypes, racial bias, and erasure of diverse African narratives and experiences. 60. LGBTQ+ discrimination and homophobia. LGBTQ+ individuals in African societies face discrimination, homophobia, criminalization of same-sex relationships, and violation of LGBTQ+ rights, leading to stigma, violence, and exclusion based on sexual orientation and gender identity. 61. Refugee and asylum seeker challenges. African refugees and asylum seekers experience displacement, persecution, human rights violations, and challenges in accessing protection, resettlement, and durable solutions, requiring support for refugee rights, asylum processes, and humanitarian assistance. 62. Mental health stigma and support services. Melanin-rich African communities encounter stigma, cultural taboos, and limited access to mental health services, counseling, and support for mental well-being, highlighting the need for mental health awareness, destigmatization, and culturally competent care. 63. Indigenous rights and cultural preservation. Indigenous African communities face marginalization, loss of ancestral lands, erosion of traditional knowledge, and threats to indigenous cultures, necessitating respect for indigenous rights, land stewardship, and cultural heritage preservation. 64. Criminal justice system inequities. Melanin-rich African individuals experience bias, racial profiling, unjust treatment, and disproportionate incarceration rates in the criminal justice system, highlighting systemic racism, disparities in legal representation, and challenges in achieving justice and fair trial processes. 65. Refugee and migrant integration challenges. African migrants and displaced populations encounter integration barriers, xenophobia, discrimination, and lack of social support in host countries, impacting their rights, inclusion, and opportunities for social integration, cultural exchange, and community cohesion. 66. Urban poverty and informal settlements. Melanin-rich African urban residents face urban poverty, inadequate housing, informal settlements, lack of basic services, and housing insecurity, highlighting the need for equitable urban development, affordable housing solutions, and inclusive urban planning approaches. 67. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, and mass atrocities. African populations have faced genocides, ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities, and conflict-related violence, leading to loss of lives, human rights violations, displacement, and intergenerational trauma, necessitating accountability, transitional justice, and peace-building efforts to address historical injustices and promote reconciliation. 68. Environmental injustices and climate change vulnerability. African communities experience environmental injustices, pollution, land degradation, climate change impacts, and disproportionate vulnerabilities to environmental hazards, exacerbating inequalities, displacement, and environmental health risks. 69. Language and cultural rights. Melanin-rich African linguistic and cultural heritage is often marginalized, threatened, or erased due to colonization, globalization, and language policies, emphasizing the importance of language revitalization, cultural preservation, and promotion of diverse cultural expressions. 70. Food insecurity and nutrition challenges. African populations confront food insecurity, malnutrition, inadequate access to nutritious food, and challenges in agricultural productivity, necessitating sustainable food systems, equitable access to food resources, and nutrition interventions to address hunger and food-related health issues. 71. Disability rights and inclusion. Melanin-rich African individuals with disabilities face barriers to accessibility, social stigma, lack of support services, and discrimination based on disability, highlighting the need for disability rights advocacy, inclusive policies, and accessible infrastructure to promote full participation and equality. 72. Child protection and vulnerable children. African children are vulnerable to child labor, trafficking, violence, exploitation, and lack of access to education and healthcare, requiring child protection measures, social services, and holistic support for the well-being and rights of children in diverse contexts. 73. Cultural appropriation and exploitation. African cultures and traditions are often appropriated, commodified, misrepresented, or exploited for commercial gain, perpetuating cultural theft, misappropriation, and distortion of African heritage, calling for respect, recognition, and protection of cultural rights and intellectual property. 74. Water scarcity and sanitation challenges. African communities face water scarcity, inadequate sanitation facilities, water pollution, and water-related diseases, posing threats to public health, hygiene, and sustainable water management, necessitating access to clean water, sanitation services, and water resource conservation initiatives. 75. Political repression and civic freedoms. Melanin-rich African populations encounter political repression, censorship, restrictions on freedom of expression, association, and assembly, limiting civic participation, political rights, and democratic governance, underscoring the importance of upholding human rights, democratic principles, and civil liberties. 76. Diaspora communities and transnational identities. African diaspora populations navigate transnational identities, cultural connections, and experiences of displacement, migration, and belonging across borders, fostering solidarity, cultural exchange, and community resilience within diverse diasporic networks and global contexts. 77. Intersecting discrimination and multiple marginalizations. Melanin-rich African individuals may experience intersecting forms of discrimination, multiple marginalizations, and compounded vulnerabilities based on factors such as race, gender, age, sexuality, disability, socioeconomic status, or migration status, requiring holistic approaches, intersectional analyses, and inclusive interventions to address complex and interconnected forms of oppression and inequality. These examples underscore the multifaceted nature of discrimination and inequities faced by melanin-rich African populations in various spheres of society, highlighting the urgent need for intersectional approaches, solidarity, and systemic changes to address systemic racism, colonial legacies, and social injustices.